In the quiet hills of what is now Slovakia, an eerie silence hangs over the ruins of Čachtice Castle. The walls, weathered by time, still seem to whisper of terror. Centuries ago, this fortress bore witness to horrors that would echo through history, giving rise to one of Europe's most chilling legends, the tale of Countess Erzsébet Báthory, a noble woman whose crimes were so brutal, so vast, that she earned the nickname the Blood Countess. But unlike the stories of ghouls and vampires, this tale isn't rooted in folklore alone. It is anchored in legal records, eyewitness accounts, and hundreds of missing girls. Erzsébet Báthory was not a myth. She was a real woman, noble by birth, educated, wealthy, powerful, and according to some accounts, responsible for the torture and murder of hundreds of young women under the guise of maintaining her beauty, her status, and her control. This is not the story of a deranged serial killer hiding in shadows. No, Erzsébet operated in broad daylight, shielded by her title, her wealth, and society that revered noble blood more than human life. She lived at a time when class divided not just society, but morality. The peasantry had no voice, and nobility had nearly unchecked power. It was a world where cruelty could be cloaked in custom and justice twisted by privilege. Born in 1560 into prestigious Báthory family, one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Hungary, Erzsébet was destined for influence. Her family's reach extended across the region, tied by blood to kings, cardinals, and generals. She received a noble woman's education, fluent in Latin, German, and Hungarian. She was brilliant, commanding, and cunning, but beneath the elegant manners and courtly grace lay something darker, something cruel. Some would later say she was cursed by inbreeding. Others would claim she was simply a woman corrupted by absolute power and sadistic impulse. Married at the age of 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander often away at war, Erzsébet found herself in control of vast estates and servants, many of them young peasant girls brought in to serve her. What happened to these girls in the bowels of her castles would remain hidden for years. But the stories eventually came out. Tales of girls beaten with iron rods, stabbed with needles, burned, mutilated, starved, and worse. Some victims were allegedly lured by promises of work. Others were simply handed over by desperate families. Some say Erzsébet delighted in the screams. Others say she believed the blood of virgins could restore her youth. And yet, no one stopped her. Not the church, not the nobility, not even the king. She moved through high society untouched, her crimes cloaked by her status. This was not merely a matter of one woman's madness. It was systemic failure of society built on hierarchy and silence. Even when rumors swirled and corpses began to accumulate, she remained untouchable, because in the eyes of the law, she wasn't just a woman, she was nobility. In time, it would take a royal investigation, political pressure, and undeniable evidence to bring Erzsébet's reign of terror to an end. But even then, she was never truly held accountable, not in the way her victims were owed. Her servants were tortured and executed, but Erzsébet was bricked into a room in her castle. Hidden from view, her punishment silent and incomplete. To this day, her name invokes a shudder. Báthory, the noble woman whose crimes inspired vampire legends, gothic novels, and horror films. But behind the myth is a story far more terrifying. The story of what happens when power is absolute, when justice is blind to bloodlines, and when evil is protected by privilege. To understand how Erzsébet Báthory could carry out her gruesome crimes for so long without consequence, we must first understand the world that made her and the dynasty that protected her. Erzsébet was born into a time when noble blood meant not just privilege, but near-divine authority. It was an era in which power flowed through veins as much as through swords and laws. And Erzsébet Báthory had both lineage and influence. She was born in August of 1560, in the region of Nyírbátor, within the Kingdom of Hungary, part of the sprawling and tumultuous Habsburg Empire. Her family, the Báthorys, were one of the most powerful and ancient aristocratic families in Eastern Europe. They had produced kings, cardinals, judges, and military commanders. They ruled vast estates and could call upon armies. And Erzsébet was a child of their inner circle, connected, wealthy, and destined to rule in her own right. Her father, Baron George VI Báthory, was a member of the X branch of the family, and her mother, Anna Báthory, was from the Somlyo branch. making Erzsébet the product of intermarriage between two closely related Báthory lines. This union consolidated power and land, but also raised rumors of inherited instability. Some historians have speculated that inbreeding may have played a role in Erzsébet's later mental unraveling, though this remains speculative at best. From a young age, Erzsébet exhibited traits that set her apart from other noble children. She was exceptionally intelligent, learning to speak Latin, German, and Hungarian fluently. She was tutored in philosophy, literature, and law, a rarity for women of her time. Even her education reflected her station. She was not merely a lady of the court. She was being groomed to rule. Yet, even in her youth, there were dark rumors. One tale recounts how, as a child, she witnessed a peasant being sewn inside a dying horse as punishment for theft. Another suggests that she had fits of rage and violent outbursts, perhaps indicative of epilepsy or mental illness. Some accounts claim she delighted in torturing animals. While some of these may be exaggerations, they reveal a disturbing undercurrent that would later bloom into something far worse. At the age of 10 or 11, Erzsébet was betrothed to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, another aristocrat from a powerful family. The marriage was less about love and more about consolidating power. In 1575, when Erzsébet was 15, the two were married in a lavish ceremony attended by royalty and nobility from across the region. As part of her dowry, she brought with her the Čachtice Castle, an imposing fortress nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, one that would become synonymous with unspeakable horror. Ferenc was a soldier by profession and temperament. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary, he gained notoriety for his cruelty on the battlefield, especially against the Ottoman Turks. Some accounts suggest that he and Erzsébet shared an interest in violence, and that he may have even taught her certain torturous techniques, such as placing oiled paper between a servant's toes and setting it alight. However, these tales remain in the murky territory between myth and fact. Their union produced several children, though Erzsébet remained the more dominant figure at home, especially when Ferenc was away for long stretches during his military campaigns. This left her in charge of managing the vast Nadasdy estates, including the hiring and disciplining of servants, many of whom were young peasant girls desperate for work, education, or even a place to sleep. Over time, the household began to change. Servants spoke in hushed tones. Some vanished without explanation. Others bore bruises, burns, and signs of unspeakable suffering. Yet, no one dared question the Countess, not only because of her title, but because of the law. In feudal Hungary, noble families were essentially above prosecution. Crimes committed against peasants were rarely investigated. A noble's home was their kingdom and their word law. If a baron or countess said a servant had run away, no questions were asked. No justice was pursued. This legal immunity, coupled with Erzsébet's growing taste for domination and cruelty, laid the foundation for a nightmare. What began with a few beatings would soon escalate into a systematic regime of torture and murder. The line between punishment and sadism dissolved. And all the while, Erzsébet continued to play the part of a benevolent noblewoman, writing letters, overseeing land disputes, and corresponding with bishops and kings. But behind the thick walls of her castles, a different face emerged, one that reveled in screams, one that viewed human life as expendable, and one that believed her status could protect her forever. She was entirely wrong. The grandeur of Čachtice Castle once symbolized the power and influence of the Báthory Nadasdy family. Perched on a hill in what is now western Slovakia, the castle stood as a proud sentinel over vast lands, with its thick stone walls and cold corridors hiding more than just political secrets. They concealed decades of suffering, bloodshed, and silence. It was within these castle walls, far from the eyes of the public and the reach of peasant justice, that Erzsébet Báthory's transformation from noble matriarch to sadistic predator truly began. With Count Ferenc Nadasdy away for long stretches of time, fighting in wars against the Ottoman Empire, Erzsébet was left in complete control of household operations across their multiple estates. These included Čachtice, Sarver, and other castles scattered across the Hungarian countryside. As Lady of the Estates, she held the power to recruit, discipline, and dismiss his household staff, and it was this power that became the gateway to horror. The victims were often young peasant girls, many between the ages of 10 and 16, brought in from nearby villages. Some were offered work as maids or kitchen help. Others were sent by desperate parents, hoping their daughters might receive some education or learn courtly manners. But these girls didn't find opportunity behind the castle gates. They found something else entirely. According to later testimonies, many of these girls were beaten for the smallest mistakes: a dropped dish, an uneven bed, a dress not ironed to satisfaction. But these punishments quickly spiraled into cruelty for cruelty's sake. One account described how Erzsébet jammed pins under girls' fingernails or sewed their lips shut with needle and thread. Another girl was allegedly forced to stand outside naked in the snow while buckets of freezing water were poured over her until she died. Others were scalded with boiling water, whipped until their flesh fell away, or burned with heated irons. And all of it took place in utter secrecy, or at least with no fear of consequence. The castle's remoteness allowed Erzsébet and her servants to operate far from scrutiny. The staff, many of whom lived in fear, dared not speak out. Peasants who suspected something remained silent. Why? Because Erzsébet Báthory was a countess. And in 16th century Hungary, that meant she was functionally above the law, at least when it came to the lives of peasants. It is said that servants who resisted or questioned orders were punished or killed, and new ones were brought in with alarming frequency. Villagers began to whisper about the number of young girls disappearing after being taken into service. Still, no one came to investigate. The nobles were not held accountable for the fates of their servants, and the Báthory name carried too much weight to be easily challenged. In time, Erzsébet's operations became more systematic. Witnesses would later testify that she kept a kind of personal staff rotation, constantly replenishing her household with new young girls. As rumors spread, it became harder to recruit locals, so her servants and accomplices were sent farther out to find victims. They traveled to distant towns, made false promises, and returned with unsuspecting girls who would never see their families again. Čachtice Castle may have been the epicenter, but the abuse wasn't confined to just one place. Servants told of hidden chambers, torture rooms, and blood-stained walls across several of Erzsébet's estates. Some even claimed that she maintained a black ledger to keep track of punishments or deaths, though no such book was ever found. Still, the consistency of testimonies, gathered later under oath, paints a clear picture. This was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a structured and sustained campaign of violence. And then came the legend of the blood. One of the most enduring and disturbing elements of the Erzsébet Báthory myth is the claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. This story, while never proven, first emerged decades after her death and may have been embellished or invented by political enemies and sensationalist chroniclers. Yet the legend stuck, cementing her place not just in historical infamy, but in Gothic horror as well. Whether she truly believed in blood as a fountain of youth, or whether the bloodshed simply fed her sadistic urges, remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that by the late 1590s, dozens, possibly hundreds, of girls had vanished into her castles, and the walls of Čachtice, once a symbol of noble strength, had become a mausoleum of innocence. Erzsébet's crimes were now impossible to ignore for those closest to her. And yet, they still weren't enough to bring her down. Not yet. The protection of her bloodline remained her strongest defense. But outside the castle walls, rumors were beginning to reach ears too powerful to ignore. The question wasn't whether Erzsébet was guilty. It was whether anyone had the courage and authority to stop her. As the years passed and the body count grew, the atrocities inside Erzsébet Báthory's castles evolved from simple acts of cruelty into chilling rituals of suffering. What began as disciplinary beatings turned into a system of deliberate torture, refined, repetitive, and almost ritualistic in its execution. The details are difficult to absorb, and perhaps even harder to believe, but they come not from legends or horror stories. They are preserved in eyewitness accounts, testimonies from accomplices, and court records that paint a grotesque portrait of one woman's descent into monstrous sadism. By the late 1590s, Erzsébet was no longer simply punishing servants. She was orchestrating systematic torment, often for her own pleasure. Her methods varied. Sometimes they were rooted in psychological cruelty, other times in physical mutilation. Servants would later testify that she devised new ways to inflict pain, experimenting with different tools, materials, and techniques. These were not spontaneous acts of rage. They were methodical and rehearsed. One of her most common punishments was the use of needles and sharp pins, which she would stab under the fingernails of her victims. She sometimes forced girls to strip naked and stand in the freezing cold, then doused them with buckets of water until they froze to death. In other cases, girls were beaten so severely with clubs, whips, or cudgels that their bones were broken, their skin flayed, and their cries echoed for hours. A particularly disturbing account from a surviving servant described how Erzsébet once bit chunks of flesh from a girl's face and shoulders with her own teeth, as if possessed by a feral instinct. Others spoke of branding girls with hot irons or forcing them to eat their own flesh, cut from their arms or faces. And if a girl died during torture, her body was casually discarded, buried in shallow graves near the castle or hidden in cellars. Erzsébet wasn't always alone in her actions. Over time, she surrounded herself with a small circle of devoted female servants and aides who helped her carry out these horrors. Among them were Dorothea, nicknamed Dorka, Ilona Joe, Catalin Benica, and a mysterious figure named Fixco, a young man who served as a kind of bodyguard and assistant. These individuals would later stand trial and testify against the Countess, providing horrifying details of the inner workings of her torture chambers. But what motivated these atrocities? Was it belief in supernatural power? Sadistic obsession? Madness? One theory, popularized in later retellings, is that Erzsébet believed blood had rejuvenating properties, particularly the blood of virgins. This idea gave rise to the infamous claim that she bathed in the blood of her victims to retain her youth and beauty. While no contemporary trial records mention bloodbaths specifically, the association stuck, especially in the centuries after her death, when myth began to overtake fact. Modern historians tend to view the bloodbath story as an exaggeration or fabrication, perhaps introduced by political enemies to paint Erzsébet as a literal monster. However, the truth doesn't need embellishment. Even without the baths of blood, the actual documented crimes are horrifying enough. There are also suggestions that Erzsébet suffered from mental illness, possibly exacerbated by epilepsy, inherited disorders, or intense psychological trauma. Yet her cruelty seemed too calculated to be attributed solely to madness. She kept her crimes hidden from the public, instructed her accomplices in silence, and maintained her public image as a composed and competent noble woman. This was not the behavior of a woman lost entirely to delusion. It was something more chilling, a woman who knew what she was doing and did it anyway. Still, Erzsébet didn't act alone, and her crimes weren't committed in a vacuum. The system of feudal law and social hierarchy in Hungary allowed her to act with impunity. The lives of peasants were seen as disposable, especially when weighed against the honor and prestige of the nobility. The societal framework enabled Erzsébet's actions and silenced those who might have spoken out. Even clergy and local magistrates feared reprisal if they accused her too openly. As time went on, her crimes became more brazen. When it became harder to find peasant girls, she allegedly turned her attention to daughters of lesser nobles. Girls sent to her castle to be educated as ladies-in-waiting. That was her fatal mistake. Nobility may have protected her from justice when her victims were peasants, but not when they were other nobles' children. The walls of protection around Erzsébet Báthory were beginning to crack. But still, no one dared confront her directly. Whispers carried from village to village. Stories spread among travelers. Rumors reached the court. And finally, someone decided to listen. The reckoning had begun. By the early 1600s, the number of missing girls linked to Countess Erzsébet Báthory had grown too large to dismiss. Rumors of bloody gowns, screams from castle basements, and girls vanishing after entering her service were spreading across the region like a plague. And yet, no authority moved against her. No arrest was made. No charges were filed. How could a woman, even a noble woman, commit hundreds of crimes without consequence? The answer lies in feudal Hungary's brutal social hierarchy and in the legal and cultural immunity afforded to the aristocracy. To understand why Erzsébet Báthory operated untouched for so long, we must examine the system that allowed her to hide her crimes in plain sight. In 16th and 17th century Hungary, the nobility wielded immense power, often rivaling that of the crown. Landowners like the Báthorys and Nadasdys weren't just landholders. They were effectively feudal lords, with their own laws, armies, and courts. The peasants who worked their lands and served in their households were, in many ways, without rights. If a peasant girl died in the home of a countess, there were no state prosecutors to investigate. There was no organized police force to follow up, and there were no consequences unless the crime reached the nobility itself. Peasants could not sue nobles. They couldn't accuse them publicly. The entire judicial system was structured to protect the class that controlled it. When peasant families asked about their missing daughters, they were often told the girls had run away or died of illness. Even if they suspected foul play, there was nothing they could do except whisper their fears to others and pray that someone might listen. And Erzsébet knew this. She understood the system she was born into. Her confidence didn't come just from sadism or madness. It came from an intimate understanding of her own legal invincibility. Furthermore, Erzsébet had powerful allies. Her cousin Gábor Báthory became Prince of Transylvania. Other relatives held key positions in the Habsburg court. Even her husband, Count Ferenc Nadasdy, before his death in 1604, was a revered military commander, feared on the battlefield and respected in court. Erzsébet's name carried political weight, and few were willing to confront it. Some local clergy grew suspicious and even attempted to raise concerns. According to church records, one Lutheran minister allegedly confronted Erzsébet about the bodies being buried without ceremony in the castle grounds. She responded with rage. He went no further. The church was powerful, but not always brave, especially when facing a noblewoman with ties to royalty. It wasn't just fear, it was self-preservation. For village officials, priests, and even other nobles, confronting Erzsébet meant challenging the entire system that protected the aristocracy. A direct accusation could ruin careers, lead to exile, or worse. And if a noble family like the Báthorys turned on someone politically, the consequences could be devastating. Silence became survival. There's also evidence that some people simply refused to believe the worst. Erzsébet, in public, was refined and articulate. She managed her estates well, corresponded with high-ranking nobles, and even gave money to churches and charities. She played the role of the noble widow with grace. Many dismiss the rumors as jealous gossip, spread by servants or rival families. But the truth kept leaking out, and Erzsébet's mistake, perhaps driven by arrogance, was believing she could extend her cruelty to the daughters of minor nobles and face no consequences. In her later years, she began accepting noble girls into her care under the guise of educating them in etiquette and courtly manners. These girls, too, began to disappear. And that changed everything. The deaths of noble-born girls could not be ignored. Their families had influence, wealth, and political connections. Complaints were lodged with the royal court. Whispers reached the ears of King Matthias II himself. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a threat to the legitimacy of noble rule. Still, even then, the crown hesitated. Matthias II owed Erzsébet money, a sizable debt inherited from her late husband's wartime loans. To accuse her outright might require him to repay it, and to convict her publicly would be to admit that a member of Hungary's elite had preyed upon its own people for years with impunity. The implications were explosive, so the king chose a quieter route. In 1610, he sent a trusted nobleman, György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate Erzsébet discreetly. Thurzó, a powerful figure in his own right and a relative of Erzsébet by marriage, was charged with gathering evidence, questioning witnesses, and, if necessary, intervening directly. It was a mission veiled in secrecy, designed not just to stop Erzsébet, but to contain the political fallout. The walls that had protected her for decades were finally beginning to collapse. But even then, justice would come with conditions. Because in Hungary's noble courts, justice wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about who you were, and who you could take down with you. By 1610, the horrors at Čachtice Castle could no longer remain hidden. What had once been whispered rumors among peasants were now formal complaints from noble families. Missing daughters, strange burial practices, and blood-stained rumors had finally reached the ears of King Matthias II. Yet even then, he moved cautiously. The woman at the center of these accusations was no ordinary suspect. She was Erzsébet Báthory, a member of one of Hungary's most powerful families. Any direct action would risk political backlash, noble unrest, and the unraveling of dynastic alliances. So the king turned to someone he trusted, Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, as the kingdom's highest-ranking official after the monarch himself. Thurzo was uniquely positioned to handle such a delicate matter. More importantly, he was a relative of Erzsébet's by marriage, making him a politically neutral but personally familiar figure. His assignment was twofold: investigate Erzsébet Báthory discreetly and contain the scandal. Thurzo did not act hastily. He began by collecting testimonies from witnesses and survivors, using his authority to compel cooperation from villagers, castle staff, and even members of the clergy. He interviewed dozens. Some sources say over 300 witnesses in total, each recounting gruesome stories of missing girls, secret burials, and the sounds of screams echoing from behind stone walls. The consistency of these reports was chilling. Names, dates, and methods aligned. The portrait they painted of Erzsébet was not just horrifying, it was undeniable. Servants who had escaped told of girls strung up by their wrists and cut with knives, of starvation chambers and mutilation. They described rooms stained with blood, hidden compartments where bodies were stored, and burial pits dug hastily under the castle floorboards. Some accounts claim the Countess kept a journal, recording the names of each girl killed. While no such book was ever officially produced, the sheer number of victims estimated during the investigation reached into the hundreds. Some say 650. Among the most damning evidence were the testimonies of Erzsébet's own inner circle, those who had assisted her in the acts or turned a blind eye. Under pressure, and in some cases torture, her closest attendants began to talk. Dorothea Senes, Ilona Joe, Catalin Bonica, and Fixco all describe how they had helped restrain girls, dispose of bodies, and clean up blood from the castle halls. These were not vague accusations. They were eyewitness confessions, and they placed Erzsébet at the center of it all. Still, Thurzo hesitated. The question was not only whether the crimes occurred, it was what to do about them. A public trial of a noble woman of Erzsébet's stature could rock the very foundations of Hungarian nobility, and worse still, it could expose the monarchy's own long-standing silence on the matter. King Matthias was still indebted to the Báthory family. A conviction could mean paying back a fortune, something the crown was neither eager nor able to do. So a decision was made. Erzsébet Báthory would be caught in the act, but her punishment would be quiet, swift, and contained. On December 29, 1610, Georgi Thurzo led a contingent of soldiers and officials to Čachtice Castle. What they found confirmed the worst of the rumors. According to multiple reports, they discovered a girl's corpse in the castle courtyard, another barely alive and covered in wounds, and others imprisoned inside, malnourished, terrified, and marked by recent torture. Blood was smeared on walls. Instruments of pain were scattered throughout the castle chambers. Thurzo reportedly wrote in a letter that the scene was shocking beyond all belief. Erzsébet was immediately placed under arrest, but not in chains. She was, after all, still a countess. Rather than being dragged to court like a common criminal, she was confined to her own castle, placed under house arrest until further notice. Her accomplices, however, were not granted the same mercy. They were detained and transported for interrogation and trial. News of the arrest spread quickly. The Báthory name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now associated with horror and shame. The kingdom braced itself. Would the Countess be tried publicly? Would the full extent of her crimes be revealed to the world? Not quite. The Habsburg court wanted justice, but not scandal. Thurzo himself reportedly wrote to Erzsébet's relatives, saying it closed the matter in silence, out of respect for her family name. A full trial would be too damaging. A quieter solution was more politically palatable. And so, even in her downfall, Erzsébet remained partly shielded by her bloodline. The investigation had exposed her, but the system that once protected her still softened the blow. Justice was coming, but it would arrive on different terms. The focus would now shift to the trial of her servants, and the crafting of punishment that satisfied the court while preserving the illusion of noble honor. The mask had been lifted. The world now knew the horrors of Čachtice. But Erzsébet Báthory, the most prolific female killer in history, would never see a courtroom. With Erzsébet Báthory placed under discreet house arrest in her own castle, The Habsburg court turned its attention to her servants. Unlike the Countess, they had no titles to shield them, no powerful bloodlines to temper judgment. Their loyalty to Erzsébet, once a shield of favor, had become their noose. For the court to appear just, someone had to face public reckoning. And so the burden of accountability was passed down the social ladder. In January 1611, a public trial commenced in Bitka, a Slovak town near the center of the Báthory estate holdings. Presiding over the court was Judge Theodosius de Sullo, tasked with interrogating and sentencing the Countess's household staff. The trial featured damning testimonies, horrifying details, and a grim theatricality designed to satisfy public outrage, without implicating the higher echelons of nobility. The star witnesses were Erzsébet's own inner circle, Dorothea Senes, known as Dorka, Ilona Joe, Catalin Benica, and mysterious male servant János Jerry, nicknamed Fixco. These individuals had been closest to Erzsébet during her reign of terror. Under oath, and sometimes under torture, they revealed chilling accounts of how the murders were orchestrated. Dorothea claimed she often helped lure young peasant girls into the castle, under the pretense of employment. Once inside, many never left. She described beatings with clubs, burnings with heated irons, and even mutilations using scissors, needles, and red-hot pincers. Ilona testified that Erzsébet would force her to bite flesh off the victims, or smear their wounds with honey and leave them be devoured by insects. Fixco, described as mentally impaired, offered a disjointed but corroborative account, one that supported the broader tapestry of horror woven by the others. Many of the confessions were undeniably grotesque. Yet, it remains uncertain how much was fact and how much was amplified by fear, pain, or the court's desire for spectacle. Torture was a common tool of interrogation in the 17th century, and the boundaries between truth and coercion often blurred in blood. One chilling detail recurred throughout multiple testimonies: Erzsébet's alleged obsession with blood. Some said she bathed in it, others that she drank it to preserve her youth. While modern historians debate the truth of this claim, suggesting it may have been fabricated to feed the Gothic myth, it was widely accepted at the time. The legend of the Blood Countess was already forming, fueled by both court transcripts and whispered folklore. As the proceedings unfolded, the courts sought to maintain an uneasy balance. Justice had to be served, but only to those who couldn't damage the reputation of the aristocracy. Erzsébet's name was mentioned in testimony, but she was never indicted or called to court. In legal terms, she remained above the fray, despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Her relatives, eager to preserve the family's reputation and retain their estates, even negotiated with the crown to keep her out of the public trial. The sentences were brutal. Dorothea Senes and Ilona Joe were found guilty of multiple counts of murder and torture. As punishment, their fingers were torn out with hot pincers, after which they were burned alive at the stake. Fixco, considered less responsible due to his mental state, was beheaded and then thrown into the flames. Catalin Benica received a more lenient sentence, likely due to her younger age and lesser involvement. She was imprisoned for life. These executions were held in public, meant as a warning to others who might support or enable such depravity. But they also served another purpose. They diverted the blame. The noble woman remained untouched, her crime sanitized through proxies. Justice had been symbolically performed, but selectively applied. Interestingly, many villagers who testified at the trial expressed not just fear, but shock at the extent of the crimes. Though rumors had long circulated about missing girls and cruelty behind castle walls, the scale and cruelty described in court stunned even the most jaded observers. The court documents read like something out of Dante's Inferno, a catalog of inhumanity masquerading behind lace and nobility. Yet, even amid the executions, a chilling silence surrounded Erzsébet's fate. No formal charges were ever brought against her. No trial date was set. No royal decree declared her guilty. Her crimes, though laid bare, were handled quietly, delicately, politically. This paradox, the guilty left untried and the servants made martyrs of accountability, echoed far beyond the courtroom. It revealed a darker truth. That in the world of Erzsébet Báthory, power could not only commit horrors, it could also erase them. Behind her castle walls, the Countess still lived, She had been exposed but not condemned, punished but not prosecuted. The legal immunity that had shielded her for years now morphed into a silent prison. But her final judgment was still to come. While the flames consumed her servants in public squares and their ashes scattered the wind, Erzsébet Báthory was quietly entombed, alive. Her castle in Čachtice, once the epicenter of noble elegance and unspeakable terror, became her prison. But this imprisonment was far from typical. There were no iron chains, no court sentence, and no written confession. Erzsébet's punishment was unspoken exile, a calculated silence crafted by the aristocracy to preserve the illusion of justice while sparing a noble name. In December 1610, just weeks after Palatine Thurzo's investigation, Erzsébet was placed under house arrest, a term deceptively mild. What it truly meant was confinement within the cold stone walls of her own fortress. Hidden from public view, her wings of the castle were sealed off. A few loyal guards kept watch. No guests were permitted. No trial. No voice in her own defense. She became a ghost in her own home. Out of sight, out of court, but not out of legend. Reports from the time suggest that her chambers were walled up with only a small slot left to pass food and water. Some historians debate the literal truth of this claim, pointing out that such a condition would be fatal within weeks. But metaphorically, Erzsébet was buried alive, a woman of immense power now reduced to silence, isolation, and the slow passage of regret or madness. Her relatives, the influential Natesty and Báthory families, ensured she was never officially convicted. This allowed her estate and titles to remain intact and preserved the family's place in the aristocratic hierarchy. As long as Erzsébet never stepped into the public sphere again, the nobles could pretend justice had been served. Over the next few years, the once feared Countess was rarely mentioned in court or church records. Her name faded from polite conversation, replaced by rumors, whispers, and growing folklore. Peasants spoke of her as if she were a specter. Some claimed they saw her wander in the castle halls by candlelight, her face paler than death, her hands still stained with blood no soap could cleanse. Others believed she had died, and her ghost haunted the very land she had drenched in suffering. Erzsébet's confinement lasted nearly 4 years. It is unclear how she endured those long, slow days. No visitors, no court, no attendants save a few servants, and guards sworn to secrecy. Did she reflect on her actions? Did she feel remorse? Or did her mind unravel slowly in the absence of an audience for her cruelty? One of the few remaining written traces of her final years comes from a letter she wrote to her son, Pal Natesty. In it, she asked for leniency and help, insisting she was innocent of the charges. "They have wronged me," she wrote. "I am no monster." Whether this was a plea for redemption or the delusion of a narcissist is lost time. Pal never publicly defended her, though he did intervene to prevent harsher punishment. On August 21st, 1614, a guard found her dead in her chamber. She was 54 years old. There was no sign of violence or struggle, only silence. A woman once surrounded by screams had died without a sound. Her death was as quiet as her punishment. No ceremony, no public notice, and no trial. Just a whisper behind sealed doors. Initially, Erzsébet's body was buried in the local church of Čachtice, but when the townspeople discovered this, they demanded her remains be removed. She was then quietly reinterred in the Báthory family crypt in Ext, her ancestral home. Even in death, she was moved about like a piece on a chessboard, feared, hated, but never held fully accountable. Her story did not end with her burial. In fact, her legend only grew stronger after death. The centuries that followed would paint Erzsébet as more than a noble murderer. She became a myth, a symbol of female cruelty, a vampiric figure of Gothic horror. Plays, poems, books, and films would all reinvent her story, often focusing on the most gruesome and unverified details. Bloodbaths, eternal youth, supernatural evil. Yet beneath those dark embellishments lies a truth far more chilling. A woman born into power, allowed to kill without consequence, and hidden away not to protect the public, but to protect her class. Her blood-soaked reign was not ended by justice, but by political convenience. In her final days, Erzsébet Báthory was not a countess, nor a prisoner, nor a villain in a trial. She was something far more haunting, a ghost kept alive by silence. When Countess Erzsébet Báthory died in 1614, she should have been quietly forgotten. No trial had immortalized her name. No grave had marked her legacy. And yet in the silence left behind, a new force began to speak. Myth. It began with whispers. Oral tales passed from villagers to travelers, from the crumbling halls of Cactus to the far corners of Europe. They spoke of a noble woman who bathed in the blood of virgins to maintain her beauty, a woman whose cruelty rivaled any beast, who used silver needles and red-hot tongs not for torture, but for pleasure. These stories, grotesque and exaggerated, took root quickly, because the truth they obscure was already horrifying. The idea that Erzsébet bathed in blood is perhaps the most enduring element of her legend. This claim appeared more than a century after her death, first written in 1729 by Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarazzi. It was Tarazzi's sensational chronicle, Tragica Historia, that transformed Erzsébet from a historical criminal into something far more monstrous, a bloodthirsty vampire nobility. He described her bathing in the blood of young women, to preserve her youthful appearance, a horrific vanity paired with ageless evil. His words would echo for centuries. Soon, poets and playwrights took up the tale. Erzsébet became a stock character in Gothic horror, a seductive, beautiful woman with a heart of ice and a thirst for blood. As the vampire myth evolved in literature during the 18th and 19th centuries, Erzsébet's story began to bleed into the archetype of the female predator, much like the femme fatale, but with fangs and nobility. By the time Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, Erzsébet's legend had already helped define the European imagination of vampirism. Though Stoker never directly cited her, the themes of blood, nobility, and perversion that surround Count Dracula are eerily reflective of Erzsébet's lore. Many scholars argue that she was the female counterpart to Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Dracula. Together, they represented a dark fantasy, aristocrats who fed upon the lower classes, literally and metaphorically. Throughout the 20th century, Erzsébet's myth flourished in literature, film, and television. She appeared as a central figure in Countess Dracula, 1971, a Hammer horror film that played heavily on her bloodbath myth. In that telling, she is a twisted beauty who must kill to keep her youthful face, a tragic villain undone by time. More recently, she has surfaced in video games, comic books, and even anime as a vampire queen or immortal sadist. But while pop culture leaned into the supernatural, historians began pulling back the curtain on the real Erzsébet. They questioned the validity of the accusations, examined the motivations of those who stood to gain from her downfall, and uncovered inconsistencies in the court testimonies. Some even suggested she had been framed by political enemies who wanted her land and titles. After all, she was a wealthy, powerful widow, a woman whose existence in that era posed a threat. Still, even the most generous revisionist historians concede the weight of the testimonies. Dozens of witnesses, including castle staff and noble informants, described scenes of unspeakable cruelty, the mutilated corpses, the secret rooms, the rituals. Whether all of it was true, exaggerated, or invented, it reflected something deeply unsettling about how society responds to power and violence, especially when cloaked in nobility. That is what makes Erzsébet Báthory such a compelling and terrifying figure. She exists in the blurry space between fact and fable, where history cannot or will not draw a line. In her we see the truth about unchecked privilege, the manipulation of justice, and a hunger for eternal youth twisted into literal hunger for blood. What the world remembers of Erzsébet may be more legend than fact, but it speaks volumes about the cultural anxieties she came to represent. Female power unrestrained, nobility without justice, and the body is both object and weapon. Today, her name is synonymous with horror. Tourists visit the ruins of her castle, hoping to glimpse the past. Writers invoke her in Gothic novels. Feminist scholars debate her legacy, and horror fans embrace her as one of the first true monsters of recorded history. But whether you call her a vampire, a serial killer, or a victim of political conspiracy, one truth remains. Erzsébet Báthory is eternal not because of blood magic, but because the world refuses to forget her. As the final stone settled over Erzsébet Báthory's sealed chamber in 1614, it seemed the world had closed the book on her nightmare. But centuries later, that book is not only still open, it has become an entire library of retellings, speculations, and dark fascinations. Her story lingers not merely because of the crime she was accused of, but because of what she represents. The lethal cocktail of unchecked power, gendered fear, legal corruption, and the seductive myth of immortality. Erzsébet was not a wandering predator from the shadows. She was a product of her time and class, a noble woman born into immense privilege, educated beyond most of her peers, and groomed to rule vast lands. Her castle was a fortress not just of stone, but of status. And it was that status that allowed her, allegedly, to kill dozens, if not hundreds, without fear of consequence. This is what makes her tale more than a Gothic horror. It's a case study in legal immunity. A woman from a lower class could never have committed even a fraction of Erzsébet's alleged atrocities without facing the full wrath of the law. But Erzsébet? She wasn't arrested until years of rumors, dozens of missing girls, and mounting pressure from local clergy and aristocrats forced an investigation. Even then, she wasn't tried, wasn't sentenced, and wasn't executed. Her family made sure of that. Instead, she was walled up in her castle, with only a slit for air and food. Not a criminal, not a martyr. Something in between, a compromise between truth and politics. Her fate raises timeless questions. What does it mean when the law protects those with power rather than the innocent? How many victims were silenced before someone listened? And how many more stories like Erzsébet's remain buried because their perpetrators wore crowns or crests? But Erzsébet's legacy is not just legal, it's deeply cultural. Her myth became a mirror for society's fears about women, especially powerful women. The image of the blood-bathing countess is more than horror fantasy. It plays on ancient anxieties about female vanity, sexuality, and wrath. In some ways, Erzsébet became the monstrous projection of what a woman was not supposed to be. Wealthy, beautiful, violent, and beyond control. And yet, that same myth also made her a figure of dark empowerment in some corners of modern thought. Feminist scholars have asked whether Erzsébet's crimes were exaggerated to tarnish a woman who held too much authority in a man's world. Others argue that the very idea of excusing her actions through gender undermines the voices of her victims. These tensions reflect a modern discomfort with moral complexity. Erzsébet was a woman, yes, but she may have also been a murderer, a sadist, a monster created not by myth, but by willful cruelty. Today, you'll find her name attached to tourist tours, vampire fiction, and even fashion lines inspired by her legend. Her ruined castle in Čachtice remains a magnet for thrill seekers and historians alike, and her story continues to appear in documentaries, horror films, and academic texts. She has become a permanent figure in our cultural memory, more infamous than Vlad the Impaler, more mysterious than Jack the Ripper, and more enduring than many actual monarchs. But perhaps the most chilling part of Erzsébet Báthory's story is not what she did, it's how easily she got away with it. For years, in plain sight, protected by her name. And when justice finally came knocking, it arrived not with a sword or gallows, but with a whisper and a stone wall. No trial, no confession, just silence. That silence continues today in many parts of the world, where power still shields people from consequence, where wealth can buy silence, where victims go unheard. And in that way, Erzsébet's story isn't ancient at all, it's timeless. So the next time you hear about her, in a ghost story, a vampire film, or a tour guide's chilling tale, remember this. Behind the blood and the legend, behind the castle walls and the eternal beauty myths, lies a woman who reminds us what happens when power meets impunity. And the world looks away. If history were honest, it would warn you, power hides monsters. Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more chilling true tales from the shadows of the past. Turn on notifications, so you never miss a story history tried to bury.